Welcome to the front lines in the war on ISIS. This is the Syrian town of Kobani, and this is all that remains of Main Street. This city has been holding out against an ISIS onslaught of thousands of militants for the last several weeks, and it's been paying a heavy price for its resistance. To understand what's going on in the war on ISIS, you need to know what's happening here. We'll have reports from here coming up as we examine the U.S.-led strategy against ISIS. What's working, what's not, in our live report that begins right now. Good evening, I'm Richard Engel. We've now left Kobani and are coming to you from Urfa on the Turkish side of the border. It's been 3 months since the U.S. launched a war against ISIS. As a nation, we've been at war in this part of the world for over a decade, and it looks like we could be at war for another 10 years, maybe more. Imagine that. Tonight, we're going to ask some tough questions about the war against ISIS. We'll be joined by former CIA Director Michael Hayden and by Lieutenant General Mike Barbero, who was one of the top commanders during the Iraq War. Earlier this year, in an off-the-cuff remark that drew heavy criticism, President Obama said he had no strategy yet for taking on ISIS. Then, in September, he addressed the nation.
My fellow Americans, tonight I want to speak to you about what the United States will do with our friends and allies to degrade and ultimately destroy the terrorist group known as ISIL.
The president promised this war would be different, with no American boots on the ground. Instead, he said there would be, quote, Iraqi boots on the ground in Iraq and Syrian boots on the ground in Syria. It sounds good, but where are they? I've been reporting on this region for years, and people I speak with tell me that this is one of the key problems with the U.S. strategy. It's disconnected from what's actually happening and seems, quite frankly, to be based on wishful thinking. It imagines that we have united allies. It imagines that the Iraqi government is legitimate and capable. It imagines that there are moderate Syrian rebels who want what we want. It imagines a Middle East that doesn't exist. In the real Middle East, ISIS has managed to break out of its traditional strongholds in Fallujah and Ramadi, capture Iraq's second-largest city, Mosul, and take over about half of Syria. In less than 6 months, ISIS erased the border between Iraq and Syria and carved out an area the size of Maryland, declaring it an Islamic state. Washington calls this state a cancer. The cure, it says, is not to send in one army, but to prop up 5 armies. In central Iraq, the U.S. is rebuilding and retraining the Iraqi army. In western Iraq, it's paying Sunni tribes to join the battle. In northern Iraq, it's sending guns to the Kurds. In northern Syria, Washington says it will stand up a moderate rebel army. And in southern Syria, although U.S. officials don't like to admit it, the regime of President Bashar al-Assad is still in power and growing stronger. The fact is, these groups hate each other and are in no condition to put up a united fight against ISIS. In the wider region, the U.S. is counting on support from Muslim countries like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Turkey. But they've at times supported radical groups like ISIS. The U.S. has tried to sort out the divisions between Sunnis and Shiites and Kurds in the past. It did not go well. Now we're trying it again on a larger scale and by remote control. The president has said it will take years, as he put it, to degrade and eventually destroy ISIS. He's been fairly cautious. Vice President Biden, not so much.
We will follow them to the gates of hell until they are brought to justice. Because hell is where they will reside. Hell is where they will reside.
Well, for the past several weeks, the gates of hell have had a very specific address, the town of Kobani in Syria, just across the border from here. But the U.S. and its allies didn't chase ISIS there until, according to a senior U.S. military officials, it was almost too late. But Kobani is still holding on, as we found out when we visited the little city that stood up to ISIS. There are 2 things about Kobani that made this small Kurdish city in Syria the focus of international attention. The first is its location, just across the border from Turkey, which means the world's press has watched and reported as the ISIS onslaught reduced large parts of the city to smoking piles of rubble. The other is the heroic resistance of the people of Kobani. Theirs is a remarkable tale of courage under fire. It's a tale that couldn't be told because, surrounded and cut off from the world, Kobani was too dangerous for reporters to visit. A fact that was not lost on ISIS. In a slickly produced video, they introduced a report from Kobani.
Hello.
Presented by one of their hostages, British photojournalist John Cantley, who'd been forced to become a mouthpiece for his captors. In the video, he mocks reports of an ISIS retreat from parts of the city and the outlets that publish them.
The Western media, and I can't see any of their journalists here in the city of Kobani, have been saying recently that the Islamic State are on the retreat.
Cantley went on to claim that ISIS had control of 90% of the city and was now involved in mop-up operations. We decided to risk a trip into the besieged city to see for ourselves.
Let's go.
We crossed the no man's land and entered Kobani. What we found was a city demolished but undefeated. ISIS controls no more than 50% of Kobani, and American airstrikes are gradually reducing that area to rubble. Meanwhile, on the free side of the city, Kurdish men and women, outgunned and outnumbered, are not just standing their ground, they're smiling. 34-year-old Azima is a field commander on the southern front, where much of the fighting is happening. She takes us on a dangerous tour of the frontline positions. Now we run, she says. Sheets hung across intersections cloak our movements from enemy snipers. You stay low and run fast. Azima leads us to City Hall. In Kobani now, you never enter a building through the front gate or the front door. She walks us to the council room, describing a recent battle to take the building back from ISIS.
She says there were about 40 ISIS fighters just in these rooms here. So it's not that they're fighting between buildings and across streets, but room to room. And you can see some of the damage. You can see the bullet holes. This was real close quarter fighting.
Azima shows us where the enemy is, not far. We watch them all the time, she says, and make sure to shoot them before they get too close. Outside, I ask Azima why so many of her fighters are young women. As Kurdish women, she says, we would rather lose our lives than our land or our principles. Those principles are in evidence everywhere in Kobani. These fighters are members of the People's Protection Units. Women and men live together and fight together. There are no formal ranks, no organized units, and everyone calls each other comrade. The Kurds of Kobani are a throwback, progressive idealists in a region that may be descending into medieval darkness.
One way they found to avoid the snipers is by burrowing through buildings, just punching holes in the walls so they can move from place to place without exposing themselves to the open air and exposing themselves to the snipers.
We run up an exposed staircase to an apartment on the top floor of a residential building, where the bedrooms have been turned into snipers' nests. 26-year-old Vian was once a school teacher. Now she spends her days in this room, watching and trying to find the enemy just across the street. Born and raised in Kobani, Vian says leaving was never an option. Kobani is our home, she says. Where else would we go? We will stay here and fight. It's especially important, she says, for women to be strong in the Middle East, where they are rarely seen or heard from. We stand here as symbols of strength, she adds, for all the women of the region.
So you're fighting for Kobani and fighting for women's rights in the Middle East?
Yes, she says, right now I am fighting for Kobani, but I promised myself that wherever a minority is attacked, I will be there to fight for their rights. It's these grand ambitions that have made Kobani such an obsession for ISIS. The fundamentalists consider these people infidels, to be killed or enslaved. Most of the residents of Kobani and the surrounding villages, an estimated 200,000 people, escaped ahead of the ISIS advance, leaving behind their possessions and becoming refugees in nearby Turkey. Only the old, the sick, and the very stubborn still live here.
ISIS propaganda has been saying that there are no civilians left in Kobani, only fighters, and the streets do look pretty empty, but Mahmoud Ali is taking me inside his home to show that there are still civilians here, and his family is among them, And there are plenty of civilians. You can see these children. These are your neighbors, little Jiranek.
The house is crowded, and Ali says no one here is leaving. How could I leave my land and my people, Ali asks. My brothers and neighbors died to protect this place. How can I leave it? Those who remain here rely on a system of mutual assistance for everything. There is only one bakery in town, and the bread is distributed for free all around the city. The few doctors left in town treat the wounded in a makeshift clinic in an abandoned home. Even the weapons are a result of community organizing, like this homemade tank used to ferry fighters to the front lines. ISIS, on the other hand, has state-of-the-art weapons, including tanks and armored vehicles. The only reason Kobani survived this long is because the U.S. is conducting daily airstrikes and helped negotiate reinforcements from Iraqi Kurdistan and from the Free Syrian Army. But ISIS fighters are now dug into their positions in Kobani, and driving them out of an urban area is a challenge. But did it need to be this difficult? Only a few weeks ago, we were watching on a hill in Turkey along with refugees from Kobani who watched horrified as ISIS fighters closed in on the city. The militants made no effort to hide their movements. They were marching in without a care in the world.
These people are extremely frustrated by what's happening here. They see ISIS fighters in their villages, and they say if the Americans really want to bomb ISIS, they're not hard to find.
American officials said publicly at the time that defending Kobani was not a priority.
As horrific as it is to watch in real time what's happening in Kobani, it's also important to remember you have to step back and understand the strategic objective.
With the world's cameras trained on the city, the U.S. was eventually embarrassed into coming to the rescue. The city has now become a key battleground, a test case for the American strategy in the fight against ISIS. Dijwar Havat is a legendary fighter from Kobani. We are very grateful to America for the help it has sent us, he says, but it came very late, and we are going to need a lot more of it. For those who hold the line in Kobani, all this is just a distant echo. To pass the time, Vian sings a song of mourning for her fallen comrades. She knows that Kobani can only be remembered one of two ways, as the site of a heroic victory over ISIS, or as the site of a horrific massacre. Which is why everyone in Kobani, the old and the young, women and men, carries a special bullet around. They call it the bullet of honor and plan to use it to take their own life if the enemy manages to get through the line. Better that, they say, than falling into the hands of ISIS alive. A lot more to come from here tonight, live from Urfa, including an exclusive interview with Westerners who have traveled to Syria to join radical Islamic groups. And we'll talk with the American commander who was in charge of training the Iraqi army, an army we spent years training. I'll ask him why that army collapsed.
This is the last point on the Turkish border. We're about to cross into Kobani. It hasn't been the easiest process so far. We don't exactly know what we're going to find inside. There's a lot of shelling. There's still ISIS fighters. So this is the last time we're going to be inside Turkey until we get out, and hopefully everything will be fine.